Hello everyone, Dark Skeleton here, and today I want to talk to you, especially if you're a new player of Hearthstone, about mistakes that I see new players making all the time and what you can do better to correct them and improve your game. So I have 5 things that I see new players making as a mistake all the time, and I want to touch on those. Number 1, coining on turn 1 to play a 2 mana cost card, and then on turn 2, following it up with a hero power. This is generally a very weak play for people to make, and it's not intuitive why it's so weak necessarily, because you would think, especially as a new player coming into the game, that if you don't have a 1 mana cost card in your hand, then it's so good to be able to play a 2 cost card on your first turn, and then already having a minion on the field. And yes, it does get you extra tempo, extra board presence. And that's the whole reason for having the coin, to be able to get a small advantage on your opponent in exchange for your opponent being able to go first all the time. But if your turn 2 is nothing but a hero power, that is almost always a very weak play. Maybe, and I still think in most cases it would be correct not to coin, but maybe with Rogue, it could be argued for in some cases, but generally not. And that's just because the Rogue hero power is usually so good on turn 2. But when you play a 2-cost mana minion on turn 1, and you don't have another minion to follow that up with on the second turn, then all of the board pressure and power you get immediately on that first turn is going to be effectively nullified, because on turn 2 you're going to do almost nothing. You might make a 1/1 token if you're playing a paladin, or you might fire blast your opponent's face for 1 damage. Or even in the worst cases, you might be a priest and your hero power is to heal 2 damage, but you have no targets for the healing. So even if your turn 1 is really strong, if your turn 2 is super weak to follow it up, it's usually not worth using the coin. You can use the coin for much better things. Like for instance, if you are playing a hand that has a 2 mana cost card and a 4 mana cost card, but does not have a 3 mana cost card, then you play your 2 mana cost card on turn 2, and on turn 3, you can use the coin in order to play your 4 mana cost card. And by doing that, you can make sure that your mana curve comes out smoother, that you're able to follow up your turn 2 with a turn 3. So just keep that in mind. Coining is often weak if it means that your next turn is going to be effectively nothing, so try to make efficient uses of the coin. Number 2, too many 1-drops in a deck or having a really bad mana curve, and you can't entirely blame new players for this at all. They don't know which cards are good, and they probably don't even know about mana curving for the most part, really. So what a lot of new players I've seen do is that they stack their deck with nothing but 1 mana cost cards, and I'm talking things like Goldshire Footman and Voodoo Doctor, which are generally considered weak cards to begin with. But the problem is not that they're necessarily playing those cards, but that they're only playing weak cards like that only cost 1 or 2 mana. And while those cards may be able to be played from your hand a lot faster, if you empty your hand by playing nothing but 1 mana cost cards, unless you finish your opponent off, you're going to run out of steam. You won't have anything left to play. And unless you are close to finishing your opponent off, having nothing left to play is really bad for you. It's going to make you lose the game. Because, when you have no hand, what can you do? Hero power? So, instead of playing all 1 mana cost cards, especially for new decks, it's almost always better to try to have a mix of cards. You want maybe a couple 2-drops or a handful of 2-drops, some 3s, some 4s, some 5s, even a couple 6s like Boulderfist Ogre is a pretty good way to start things off as a new player. You don't need to worry about having a perfect curve, but try to make sure that when you play your matches, that you are able to have enough cards in your hand at any point in the game, just to make sure that you can keep going and have steam. Don't make running out of cards the reason you lose. Now, there are some decks that high-ranked players can play, like Face Hunter, where you can be more aggressive and only play cards that are 3 mana or less. But that's because those decks are precisely crafted to put out as much damage as possible, so they can actually finish opponents off on turn 6 or 7, or sometimes even 5. But for any basic deck, it's very unlikely you'll be able to do that. So you want to focus on board control. Alright, so number 3, and this is kind of related to what I was just talking about, but going face with a deck or cards that are not nearly aggressive enough in order to go straight for your opponent's hero and actually win the game. So it may seem like a good idea if you're new to just keep using your minions to hit the opponent's face, because it puts pressure on your opponent, and then they're like, oh, if I keep letting him hit me, I'm going to lose the game, so I need to be the one to make the trades. However, when you actually let your opponent make the trades, that means that they get to pick the minions, which minions are going to run into which enemy minions. And oftentimes, especially when you get into the more middle of the game, you can take some of your minions and actually defeat your opponent's minions without even losing one of your own. So when you finish a minion off and your minion's still alive, that minion is still a threat on the board. And having threats on the board are often much more powerful than a couple damage to your opponent's face, because having those minions on the board adds up over the course of the game. And in addition to that, a minion that's still on the board can defeat another one of your opponent's minions. And generally, how you win games, especially when you're new to the game, is you just want to get efficient trades on your opponent's minions. So that means you want to be the guy who's actually making those trades. So whenever your opponent is just hitting your face and they're not even playing an aggressive deck, that's just a great chance for you to step in. Just do the math, figure out which minions will die if you hit them with this minion, will your minions survive, and just keep your minions alive while defeating all of your opponent's minions. That's basically 90% of all you need to do to win your first 20 or 30 games of Hearthstone. But a lot of people, they unfortunately just send all their minions to the opponent's face and don't really worry about controlling the board so much, and that's why they lose. So keep that in mind. That's a really big tip for you. And in fact, even when you're higher ranks, controlling the board is still really important. Alright, number 4, and this is a little bit specific, but it's actually almost became like a pet peeve for me. When your opponent has a minion with 5 attack and 1 health on the board, especially if you're a mage, it's a bad idea to play a 4 mana minion like a Sinjin Shield Master into that. A Sinjin Shield Master has 3 attack and 5 health. If this is your turn 4 play, and he has minions on the board including a 5/1 such as a Magma Rager or a damaged Ice Rager, specifically I was playing the Ice Rager and that's why this keeps happening, then that Ice Rager is simply going to run into that Sinjin Shield Master for a perfect trade for your opponent. Don't let your opponent send his Ice Rager that's damaged into a Sinjin Shield Master. Because not only is it a 3-drop, but it's a 3-drop that's already taken damage, so it becomes less valuable. And you're throwing away a 4-drop into that. If your opponent has a 5/1 and you put a 3/5 taunt onto the board, 99% sure that trade is going to happen, so you're giving your opponent free value. And why this is even worse when you're a mage that does this is because you have the hero power to deal 1 damage. If it costs a card, a 4 mana cost card, and, well, 4 mana, of course, to play it, in order to do the same thing as your 2 mana hero power, then you should use the hero power. Because you know what's going to happen. Your opponent's going to run their minion into your minion. You won't take any damage, but you will lose the minion. So it's just better to use the hero power in order to remove that from the board. Long story short, just keep in mind what your opponent has on the field and try not to give them good trades. Try to put minions on the board that will make you get good trades that your opponent doesn't want to trade into, or at least they won't get more than an equal trade onto your minions. Sinjin Shield Master into a Magma Rager or an Ice Rager is a pretty bad play, if you can avoid it. Okay, number 5. Using big removal spells on unworthy targets. And by this, I don't mean using Fireball to damage your opponent's face, although that is usually a incorrect play, quote-unquote. I mean more using a Fireball to destroy a 2/3 minion on your opponent's side of the board. Now, one of the reasons board control is so important is because if you get to the point where you have no minions on your side of the board, and your opponent has such an overwhelming force that they're going to be pushing for lethal damage on you pretty soon, then you might end up in the spot where you have to use a fireball to remove like a 2/3 River Crocolisk or something like that. In which case you're using a 4 mana spell to defeat a 2 mana minion, which is really inefficient, and also River Crocolisk is far inferior of a card to Fireball, so it feels bad to use it like that. But then there are players out there who are currently using Fireball really way too easily, even using Frostbolt way too easily. You have to think about how much value you're really getting out of the cards you're playing, and that applies to spells as well. If you can avoid it, save big removal spells for cards that are actually worthy of those spells. For instance, instead of fireballing a River Crocolisk, save it until your opponent plays something big, like a Water Elemental, a 3/6 that freezes enemies that it attacks for 4 mana. That would be a fair use of Fireball on that. It's at least even mana cost. Or a Boulderfist Ogre, which is a 6 mana minion, 6/7 stats. Really solid card, great for new players. I do recommend you put that in your early decks. And you could instead fireball that and use your hero power for the 7th damage in order to eliminate it from the board. If you save your big cards or your big removal cards for the cards that are actually worthy of it, you'll be thankful when those big cards come out, because if you have no answer to something like a Boulderfist Ogre, when it hits the field, it's going to stomp all over you, and that's not what you want. So save your removal spells, play your minions efficiently, make good trades, all that jazz, and it should help your game a lot. So I've been Doug Skeleton. I hope you enjoyed these tips, and I hope they help you climb in the casual play mode, or the ladder even. And I'll see you in the next video. Oh, and if you want to see more of these videos, just let me know in a comment down below. Till next time.